ask someone to mute their microphone. We're picking up a little bit of background noise there. Excuse us while we just get that right. Panelists, could you please all ensure that your microphones are muted, please? Okay, we were talking about Tanzania, and we were talking about the prospect for a much wider area for production in Tanzania. And looking at this would be a game changer from a processor's point of view in Tanzania. A crop coming in terms of the year, that means working capital strains, the biggest problem for many African cashew processors, are well relieved. So as things stand, Tanzania is fourth in the world, second in Africa. Production this year, we have a variety of estimates. So if you listen to trade figures, you can get figures in the mid 500,000s. That in itself is tremendous growth, of course. And the Cashew Board disagrees, and who knows, they may be right. They were not too far off the correct figure last year, but they're estimating a crop of about 700,000 tons. That would be revolutionary. That really does change the balance of supply and demand for the Southern Hemisphere. We're going with the figure of about 550,000 tons based on the history, based on the weather, based on the disposal of last year's crop. Tanzanian raw cashew nuts, really high quality, good taste, good processing characteristics, and they're marketed, in case you didn't know, they're marketed through the auction, which is now managed by the Tanzanian Mercantile Exchange, and quite successfully so last year. So we have a different structure in Tanzania last year, but I'm assuming most people are aware of that, so I won't go into too much detail. Tanzania has definitely entered a fast growth phase. This is not the end of it. Production is likely to continue to increase. Key things: better distribution of inputs, something that had been a real problem in Tanzania for many years. Many different systems were tried. It appears to have been organized well in the last couple of years. Better government support. Now, in the past, there has been government support, but it's been inconsistent. It remains to be seen how that works out. And of course, we've got some new processors. More about that in a moment. It's not easy to reconcile the numbers. This is a problem we're having. So, official estimate of last year's crop by the Cashew Board of Tanzania, 538,000 tons. Total imports, they were split roughly, very roughly, 50-50 between India and Vietnam. Total imports about 270,000 tons. Now we know that there is a little bit of a complexity because the imports may fall into one year or into the other year, and it's quite difficult to work out which is which, but it does look as if maybe that crop was a little bit less than the official estimate, 538. Maybe it was more like 450,000 tons. The gap is about 65,000 tons a year. Now, the Cashew Board has said to us that they think there's about 60,000 tons of processing. That's got to be small-scale processing in the country. Seems like a very large number to me, but of course, it's possible. There's definitely some smuggling. I mean, we know the smuggling. We don't know the smuggling because we've seen the smuggling. We know the smuggling because there's a huge level of export taxes. And wherever there's a huge level of export taxes, there's smuggling in any part of the world. So it seems to me that right now, maybe actually thinking that the crop was a little bit less last year than the official estimate. Time will tell. Okay, what about processing in Tanzania? It has been improving. If we look at the trade, and I like to look at trade figures for processing. The reason I like to do that is because I know that trade figures are correct. People may or may not estimate the size of their processing in any given year, there is a temptation to exaggerate. There is a temptation to consider different volumes in different ways at different times. And, we've seen that in so many places. But looking at this, trade figures, the European Union, 1,874 tons of kernels imported. That's the highest total for many years. It may actually be the highest total ever, but it's certainly the highest total in the last 10 years. And already this year, the EU has imported 809 tons of kernels from Tanzania. That's to the end of July. We also see that the US market has fallen away. It was never big, but it's fallen away in recent years. Processors are obviously concentrating on Europe. And we see that the UAE, which would seem to me like an obvious and interesting market for a product from Tanzania, that it too has fallen away in a way that we wouldn't have expected. In the future, you would expect more exports to Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, given the quality, and that would probably be in competition with Indian cashew kernels. If we look at the processing capacity, we see how it's risen. Now, here I'm talking about commercial processing capacity that's suitable for export markets. And looking at that, it's around about 25,000 tons. This year, we're expecting about 17,000 tons to be processed. Now, that fits with the export numbers, but there is clearly another sector, the secondary processing, the small processing, that feeds into domestic consumption. And you can see some of the names. And there are some well-respected names now in the business, some of them big, some of them small. All of them, as far as we can gather, all of them growing and with ambitions to grow further. So in Tanzania, looking at, still waiting for the auction to start. The crop is coming, but it's coming very slowly. We're looking at a reseller market, and this is interesting, whether people are trying to fit where prices are or whether they are actually willing to sell, and maybe that means be short at these prices, somewhere between 1630 and 1680 cost and freight. That's a little bit lower than it was a couple of weeks back. Be interesting to see now whether or not anyone goes for that and whether or not there's a lot of trade. There was a discussion that there had been some trade at 1630 for slightly lower outturn. The cashew kernels from Tanzania have been trading. It looks like the typical premium prices up around 355, 360 plus for WW320s. This is a real high quality product. This is a product with larger kernels. Even the blemished, even the scorched, even the dessert are of a relatively high quality, and many people would use those in their WW320. Certainly they compare well with the typical Vietnamese WW320 as a scorched hull. So high quality material making premium prices. The board and policy, the auction continues. Successful reinvention of the auction last year. They're looking in cooperation with processors to ease pressure a little bit, regulate some of the taxation measures in the domestic RCN market to improve access, and processors were given access to the local marketing co-ops early this season. Unfortunately, the crop didn't come in on time to make that really advantageous, so they're in a tight position again. The board has ambitions and I believe has started the construction of an industrial park in Mtwara, and they are including smaller processors and local processors as part of the policy. And I think that's intended in two ways. One, as standalone units doing the full process, but secondly, as feeder units for some of the bigger factories. That's a big undertaking. It would have a massive social impact, and it would be a diversified social impact. Time will tell whether that policy is followed through on. So Tanzania, looking healthy. Processing is growing, but growing slowly. Those processors that have got their process right are doing a good job. but it's not an easy environment to do business in. Money is expensive. The management of the supply chain is difficult. If that can be got right, and that needs the help of the Cashew Board of Tanzania, I would say the future of processing in the country is quite bright. So moving south to Mozambique, and Mozambique, like Tanzania, was one of the leaders in cashew production way back in the 1970s. Production estimates vary. So the Institute, the Nut Institute of Mozambique, that covers cashews and macadamia nuts, tells us that production is up 12%, tells us that the crop is good. But their estimate of production, rather like their estimate last year, is very high. 218,900 is their estimate. Trade estimates are very different to that. But let's just step back from that in a moment. I will have a look at that in a moment. Growing quickly, 10-year growth just under 5%. In the last 5 years, production has been growing more quickly based on the official estimates. This year, the price has been set at 45 metical per kilo. That's about $715. Same price in the Mozambique metical currency as last year, but if we convert that to dollars, it is slightly more expensive, 750 versus 680. Not really a huge difference, but it is slightly higher price. Let's have a look at you can see, actually, I just thought I'd show this. This is from IAM. They do some very good analysis, albeit we disagree on the production figure, but they do some good analysis. And you can see the orange areas. These are areas that are producing cashews, and you can see that it's, although concentrated in the north, there are cashew growing areas throughout the country. And they also have production of macadamias. The dark green are where both are produced. So really good progress on tree nuts in Mozambique. If we look going forward, so if I were to take the two estimates, the IAM estimate and the trade estimate, and project them forward, in other words, that what's happened in the last 5 or 10 years would happen again in the next 5 years, we would see production something like this. The trade estimate would be 170,000 tons, and the IAM estimate would be 240,000 tons. But a lot of activity has been taking place. So we have seen a lot of work in the country on planting additional trees. So they tell us that 3.8 million seedlings were planted in 2024, following on from 6.2 million in 2023. Now that sounds like a lot. That's 10 million trees. But let's not forget a couple of things. First of all, we won't get anything from those trees for 3 years. Secondly, we won't get any major yield from those trees for 6 to 7 years. That would mean that by 2027, an additional 15,000 tons. It doesn't mean a lot in the overall picture, but by 2030 it does. If all of those trees survived, that would be an additional 100,000 tons. Of course, all of those trees will not survive. In fact, in some areas, only about 1 in 2 trees survives. So it's a big if. I've made it a big if, and it is a big if. So if all of those trees were to survive, you would see a growth in production of about 100,000 tons. What's more interesting to my mind for the immediate future of production is the treatment of trees and the management of trees. And IAM tells us 10.6 million trees were treated in 2024. That's a lot of trees. That is remarkable, actually. 254,000 small farmers benefited from that. These are IAM figures. We are seeing some of the results of earlier programs in the current production increase. Whether or not that is actually up at this 218,000 level or not is difficult to work out. But if we were to take the IAM forecast, it would show us that by 2030, rather than the 240,000 tons that would be just a straight line forecast, it would be 462,000 tons. Reality, probably somewhere in between. This project that they are undergoing in Mozambique, if it works, will turn Mozambique into a really major producer of cashews by 2035. It's not an easy project, though. Time will tell. And obviously, there are a lot of trees to treat. So if we look at that, so let's try to get to some estimate of which figure is right, which figure makes more sense. So if we take the IAM figures and we look at the disposal of the crop, the pie chart on the left is what we get. If we look at the trade figures, so this is a mixture of industry figures from Mozambique and international trade figures, which I won't argue with. This will be what we get on the right. So there's a big difference. Then there are a couple of big differences, but one of them is that the export figures are far different. So the export figures from Mozambique are 35% higher than the destination imports. Now, again, there is distortion. Which year do you look in? December, January, as the crop straddles the end of the year, and certainly the arrival of the nuts straddles the end of the year. Secondly, the informal domestic market, if we actually extrapolate trade figures, the informal market would be about 21,000 tons of RCN. IAM says that's 35,000. I wouldn't argue one way or the other on that. There's an element of smuggling, probably into Tanzania. There's a benefit. Cashew prices are higher in Tanzania, perhaps from northern Mozambique. There would be a benefit for some processors farmers to move their product across. That happens on every border in Africa. It happens on the Mozambique-Tanzanian border. Interestingly, there are moves from IAM to cooperate with their counterparts, the Cashew Board of Tanzania, in the future, and that to me is a very constructive development. If these figures are correct in terms of the informal market or the local market or the small scale market, that would mean that Mozambique actually consumes more cashews than a country like Spain. I find that really difficult to believe, simply because in Africa generally, the local consumption of cashew kernels is very low. It is a high value product. It is grown as a cash crop. So that it would be consumed locally in this volume, to me, is somewhat surprising. So right now, I think that the overstatement of the crop is arising. I'm tending much more toward the trade figure than the IAM figure. And I think the evidence for that is the import figures from India and Vietnam. I think it's the import figures on raw cashew nuts and on Burma kernels. And I think that the indicators to me are that the yield, based on the number of trees, would be a little bit higher than expected if the crop were over 200,000 tons. I stand to be corrected on that. I would love to be corrected on that, but that's the way it looks to me right now. Focusing on processing. So Mozambique was one of the first countries in Africa to develop a processing industry, and it still has significant capacity to process. There are, according to reports, 8 operational factories, but if you remember some weeks ago, we had Gonzalo Correa from the Condor group, and actually there are fewer than the 8 factories really operational. So I'm not sure that it really makes, I'm not sure it's really true that these factories are operating to their full capacity. Certainly the export figures for kernels would not reflect that. So what we're seeing is, looking at the export figures, certainly a comeback in the volumes for export, and there's certainly, after a deep dive in 2022, 2023, there was a recovery in the RCN processed in Mozambique during 2024. And I would say some of the cashew kernels processed in Mozambique are of excellent quality. There's no doubt about this when we're of lower quality, but this appears to be gone. If we look at where they go, now we're talking about 2024 exports of cashew kernels. The standout feature is that Vietnam takes 52%. Now that's Burma kernels. So this would say that the 8 factories operational are not doing full process, many of them, though some are. Other markets, the European Union for fully processed kernels is the biggest market. Exports from Tanzania show 960,000 tons to India. India shows only 318 tons imported. There must be some question mark. We often hear about what should we call it? The process. Now we just call it smuggling. I would say there might be a bit of that going on. Nothing to do with Mozambique. That's an issue in India. Interestingly, South Africa has developed as a customer 960,000 tons, about 8% of the exports. But South Africa still buys more cashews from Vietnam. How many miles away is it? 5,000, 6,000? So this is the area that I might be more aware of, and processors in Mozambique might be more aware of the opportunity. Overall, Mozambique, I would say, like a lot of countries, difficulty with the numbers, positive moves on production, signs of a improvement in processing, but it's still a really difficult job to process successfully in Mozambique. Hopefully that will change in the future. Our third country that we look at is Indonesia. And we'll start by looking at the production areas. So as you know, Indonesia is about thousands and thousands of islands. Cashew production is concentrated in Sulawesi and the islands in the chain from Surabaya. We're looking at Lombok, Bali, Flores, these islands. I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time in Indonesia about 10 years ago. It was some of the best and most interesting times. Production is expected to be a good crop this year. Yields are low, more similar to West African yields, but the crop apparently is looking good. It has been increasing. As you can see, it's relatively static in terms of its volume. It has been increasing very slowly, but looking, and this is why I show the locations of production. If you look at that, you can see the high cost of logistics. So we've got a high quality raw cashew nuts. Some of the best cashew nuts I've ever seen were grown on the islands of Lombok and Flores. High cost logistics, high quality RCN, that adds up to a high price, high value. And we're also looking at a large domestic market. So let's have a look at the exports before we talk about that. In recent years, 80% of the exports have gone to Vietnam. That's, I think, largely for reasons of freight cost. You can see here we have Vietnam is blue, India is orange, and the total is in green. So you can see India's share has remained relatively modest for some years, but it's dipped down over the last 3 years. High cost, high freight is the main reason. But we also see that there was a dip in exports, and that's partially due to a lower crop, but it's also partially due to an increasing domestic market. And Indonesia has a large domestic market, and it is a market that is using a lot of peanuts, for example. So there must be an opportunity to increase production. So looking at this, if production is about 160,000 tons, we're looking at exports in the region of about 60,000 tons. There would be high crop losses given the nature of where production is and how it has to be moved. But let's say about half the crop is used in the domestic market. And that will increase. It's a huge country. And finally to Brazil. And Brazil, the story hasn't changed much over the last 7 or 8 years. Brazil was a huge producer. Production is mostly in the northeast of Brazil, in Ceará primarily, but also in Piauí, and then smaller volumes in those other areas you can see highlighted around it. The 56% in Ceará, Piauí, about 17%. So a relatively concentrated production in an area to which cashew trees are native and an area where production or growing of cashews is relatively straightforward. Cashews are grown on larger farms in Brazil. It seems unlikely, and I've stretched this production all the way back to 2011, 8, 9, 11, when production was up around 300,000 tons. It seems very unlikely that those days will return. I think Brazil peaked in production around 450,000 tons prior to that, but that's unlikely to happen. Now that introduces an interesting prospect. Looking at relatively steady production, not really responding to weather conditions, but not really responding to prices or anything else in recent years. If we start to look at the Brazilian market, so here is on the left, this is the Brazilian market for tree nuts. This is the import of tree nuts into Brazil from 2019 until 2023. Unfortunately, that's the latest figures I have. And what you see is a total import of tree nuts of 170,000 tons. It's quite a big number, but it's a very big country. Most of that, 43%, I think, is hazelnuts, but there are also imports of pistachio nuts, which is growing quickly, and walnuts and almonds. Brazil obviously has, as a large country, a large food processing sector, a large confectionery sector, and a growing snack sector. If we look at the imports of cashew nuts, not really in any way significant, but what we are seeing is some growth. Now we know that the imports from Ghana and most of the imports from Cote d'Ivoire are Burma kernels for finishing and reprocessing. But there is an opportunity in the longer run, I think, for an increase in the import of cashew kernels. If production in Brazil doesn't increase, if it continues to be a large user of tree nuts, which are used in all different segments, is there also a possibility that Brazil will eventually become an importer of cashew kernels? That could happen. So Brazil is becoming interesting in many different ways. So the outlook for the Southern Hemisphere. Production could hit 1 million tons in 2025. That's double production in 2010. Probably will be a little bit less than that. Really depends on the Tanzanian situation, whether or not that gap between 500,000 and 700,000 tons. Either way, it's an enormous crop and it's tremendous growth. The 1 million tons number means little, but it's an interesting observation. That will grow again by 2030 to about 1.5 million tons based on what's happening in East Africa. And Brazil and Indonesia, as two huge countries with food processing industries, may have potential for import of cashew kernels in the future. So overall, in the Southern Hemisphere, we're seeing a situation of fast development, not at the levels of West Africa or Cambodia, but nonetheless fast development. Very optimistic view by regulatory authorities there. My argument is that they're being overly optimistic. Growth will be a little bit slower than they're saying, but certainly interest for the investment in cashew processing. And I think that both Tanzania and Mozambique will see an increase in investment in cashew processing. Reason being, it's an opposite crop, it's high quality raw material, there's not a great deal of competition in the market at the moment. Barriers to investment, so in Tanzania in the past, people were worried about political risk and country risk. If the government can give assurances in those areas, we might see some further development. And I think also we'll see nationally based, domestic owned companies start to get involved in cashew processing in those countries. Very interesting times in the Southern Hemisphere. We sometimes forget about it, but not anymore. If we're looking at 5.8 million tons production in 2020, 1 million from Southern Hemisphere countries. So there you are. That's today's more detailed subject. I haven't spoken an awful lot about the market. That's because it hasn't changed a great deal. And let's see if there are any comments or questions. Stella, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the presentation. Yes, I have a couple of questions right here. Do you think that India's increasing re-export activity, do you think it's a short-term arbitrage strategy or a part of a change of structure?
Oh, I think it's a short-term balancing of inventories. Arbitrage might be glorifying it a little bit, but I think it's a balancing of inventories, and I think it makes sense. But I don't think in any way should that short-term move be interpreted as a change of structure.
Thank you, Jim. Shifting back to Tanzania, if their auction model was to change in the future, what impact would that have on the global raw cashew nut trade flow and price formation?
It would depend on how the auction might change. So what it would probably mean is that you'd get more volatility in the system. I think that's the first thing. It would very much depend on how it changed. So if, for example, by the way, I don't see that happening. First of all, let's be clear. But it's an interesting question to think about it. So first thing, yeah, if there were a free market in the export, you would still have taxation. You would still have management of the system, and presumably you would still have processors gaining access, preferential access to the supply chain. So in that sense, I don't think it would make a great deal of difference in the beginning. What it might do is it might take some of the costs out of the system. It might improve farm gate prices for farmers by reducing some of the costs in the system. It might create some speculation. So if it were to happen, which is unlikely, I think it would not necessarily have the impact of creating the kind of free-for-all that was there back before 2008, before the auction. It certainly wouldn't increase production. It wouldn't decrease production. But it is an interesting thought, and I'm sure that that's discussed from time to time. Doesn't seem likely that to happen now. Interesting question. Thank you. Stella.
Thank you, Jim. I have a question on Indonesia. We know they have a good quality of raw cashew nut and a strong local market. But what do you think is stopping the bigger investment in processing or exports?
I think the investment in processing is difficult because there is some history, but not a huge history of processing in Indonesia. The raw material is dispersed around a lot of different areas, and that makes large-scale processing quite difficult. The logistical challenges, the employment challenges would be tricky in Indonesia. I think that there may be room for processing. I think also one thing that's interesting is that there are some very large food processing companies in Indonesia that would have the capacity to build processing plants should they choose to do so. But so far they haven't chose to do so for export anyway. I think ultimately Indonesian consumption grows and it probably absorbs the crop as it stands.
Thank you, Jim. Are there any signs we should look out for with regards to the major retailers or the food brands to look at if they are shifting their cashew sourcing strategy in response to the price volatility?
I think major retailers are shifting their cashew sourcing strategy, but it's not in response to price volatility. I think major retailers are doing is they're shifting their sourcing strategy toward responsible sourcing. And part to the law, but it's to do with the demands of consumers. So people love cashew nuts. People feel cashew nuts are good for them. People want to be assured, like in many supply chains, that the products they're consuming, at very least, not doing any damage. So people look at the cashew chain and they wonder, where do my cashews come from? What's the story behind these cashews? And one of the challenges that we face is that part of the story behind the cashew kernels in any supermarket anywhere in the world is that a lot of those nuts have traveled long distances to get to consumption. Found interesting in raw cashew nuts. And that story is a difficult one to tell to consumers, particularly in areas where we have high consciousness of the environment, what they call conscience-driven consumption. And in those cases, retailers are, we can see, making moves toward origin-based sourcing. Now, they're not necessarily looking to source in any particular country. What they're looking for is to source where the product is traceable, where the product is linked to its local production community, and where the product is, of course, of good quality. And that's one of the reasons why we see such a enthusiastic interest in West African cashew kernels, particularly Ivorian cashew kernels in the European market. Hasn't quite caught fire in the United States just yet, but I'm sure that Chinese consumers and Indian consumers definitely are looking at cashews as a healthy product and probably are wondering where they come from and how they get there. And I think that is what's beginning to shift the way of marketing, but also the way of sourcing. And I think we'll see that increase in the coming years. That is a trend that's set and is unlikely.
Thank you, Jim. My last on October 29th of 2025.
Well, October 29th, we're going to focus a little bit more on markets. I've gone light on the markets today, and I wanted to talk about the Southern Hemisphere as an often neglected subject. 29th, we're going to have a look at the markets. We'll have a look at the situation in India. We'll be kind of festival demand in 2025 and looking forward to sourcing for the new crop. I'll have a look at the crops in the Southern Hemisphere as they're progressing. And stage, we'll be able to do a more detailed analysis of exactly where we stand and what are the prospects for the 2026 cashew season. It's amazing. We're getting toward the end of the year. What we're seeing is that the trade continues, export volume from Vietnam and consumption of cashew kernels, especially the big story in China, is those when we come back in 2 weeks. Of course, we'll be getting ready then for the conference in Tanzania, which is not that far away either. And I'm really looking forward to that. And we're going to do an event at the Tanzanian African Cashew Alliance conference. And I'm really looking forward to that. And I'm hoping to see you there too.
Thank you very much. We are looking forward to the next 2 weeks and having you live in Dar es Salaam at the GNEC. Let me also say thank you to the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ Movecom Cashew Project, the Sustainable Nut Initiative, and the Cashew Club. As you can see it on the screen, all Global Market Encounter sessions with Jim Fitzpatrick are available on the ACA